All right, so this is session number 3 of our Holiness study, Pursuing Holiness, a study of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And today we're in the study of Numbers, and so we're going to talk about the second of those 3 books and really kind of dive into that. So let me pray, and let's get started. God, we thank you for a chance to study your word. We pray, God, that in the midst of all of this, that as the weather kind of comes in and we get nervous about that you might remind us that you are the source of all our strength and our confidence. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. So the book of Numbers is really a book that illustrates kind of the tension about a holy God living amongst unholy people. That there is this sense in which there is this idea which the people of God, as they start to form themselves during the Exodus, as they get ready to enter the promised land, that they need to right themselves so that they can live before a God who they understand as being holy. And so that's kind of some of there. So there's some specific laws, there's an order, there's an atonement for all these people to kind of be able to survive and thrive. So we're going to look at these kind of things, and then we'll kind of see where we go. We'll kind of dive into some of the interesting kind of facts about this. The first thing we say is that God's presence demands order and protection. That's the first 4 chapters of Numbers that kind of lays into that. It really talks about the census and the camp arrangement. It establishes God's presence through a time of the tabernacle, which is the tent of meeting, which is what was there. And we read through all of the Torah, you find these stories where the tabernacle first is on the outskirts of the community, and then it kind of moves closer and closer until now it's at the center of that. And there is a symbolism there about placing God at the center of life and all of that stuff. So it's really kind of carefully organized to prevent people from being doing the wrong thing and then suffering the consequences of that. So I've given you a piece of paper that's there. The tribes are organized around this tabernacle. And so I've given you kind of a piece of paper there to kind of look at that. I'll put it on the screen too. But if you're viewing it online, there'll be a link to a PDF of this image as well. But this is kind of how the whole thing was set up. You see there in the center of it, the tabernacle, which is where the center of kind of the priestly worship happened. There was a sense in which it was where the Holy of Holies was, where the Ark of the Covenant was carried, and all that kind of stuff was all right there in the middle of that. And it was at the center of the meeting. There is the tribes are arranged around that as they go. And it's kind of interesting kind of how it's set up. The priestly kind of people, the tribe of Levi, you see their kind of arrangement. There's to the east is Aaron, Moses, and the priest, the ruling kind of elite of that group. And then there's these Kohathites, these Meratites, and these Gershonites, which are fun names to say, right? You name your next, you're having a grandkid, you name your grandkid that. There you go. So good names for you. But these tribes are there, and they're there to kind of show us some important kind of things. And so we have there in Numbers 3, 11 through 13, it says, Moses, I have chosen the Levites from Israel, and they will belong to me in a special way. When I killed the firstborns of the Egyptian, you know that story from the Exodus, right? The Passover. I decided that the firstborn sons of every Israelite family and the firstborn males of their flocks and the herds will be mine. But I accept these Levites in place of the firstborn sons of the Israelites. So as the sacrificial system of Israel develops, we start to see the continuing need to sacrifice animals, but the priests were set aside to do these priestly functions. They were put in place kind of to take the place of the firstborn child, the firstborn son that was taken in the Passover. And so that's kind of a way in which they kind of can do this. And you think about this in the Passover, they put the lamb's blood over the door to the place, and that was that lamb passed over, the angel of death passed over that. And so here, this is this idea of them placing themselves kind of in place and to help kind of be mediating on behalf of the people. That really kind of becomes what they're done. So they start to do this. There is a census that is taken, and that becomes very important. as they start to go through the census of all that stuff. It's counting very important things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then these Levites really are set up as a buffer. They're a buffer between what the people of the tabernacle and protecting that and protecting the people from God's wrath and other things like that. So each Levite clan is given a specific duty, from transporting holy items with strict warnings that if anybody touches the wrong thing, if you're not of this tribe and this is your job, and you touch even a pole to carry the tabernacle, you're going to die. It's kind of this idea that it's just like a very organized, and you're supposed to be able to do that. So they do that. So all right. So let's look at this. Let's look at this kind of arrangement things here of this picture of these tribes and how it's set up. So you have these Kohathites. The Kohathites are part of the tribe of Levi that's responsible for carrying the sacred objects inside. So they go inside, they pick up the sacred objects, and they carry those sacred objects inside, and they must go. They must not go or even look at the sacred objects, though, until Aaron, the priest, the high priest, and his sons have covered the objects. So they don't get to look at them. They just got to be covered up, and once they're covered up, they get to pick them up and move them. If they break those rules, then their entire clan is going to be wiped out, it says. So they make sure that Aaron goes and his two sons go into the tent with him, and they tell them, all right, now you can pick this up and you can carry this, and that's kind of how it works. And then there's these Gershonites. The Gershonites are responsible for carrying the curtains of the sacred tent. So the tabernacle is a tent. It's set up with the poles, and there's curtains that divide certain areas, the Holy of Holies, and the different courts that are inside that tabernacle that will later be in the temple. And they're responsible for carrying the curtains of that. And the Merarites can be responsible for carrying the frames of the tent, the poles of the tent, and other things like that. So it's all divided up, and each person is responsible for that. This becomes important because if we talk about these tribes and the arrangement of the tribes, one of the things they're set up for is how the people of God are people on the move, and they're moving with purpose. They're not just wandering, as it says, kind of, we hear them say they're wandering in the wilderness, but there's more to it than just wandering. There's a purposeful kind of way in which they're marching towards the place where God is having them go at this point. So there are also a lot of instructions in this section of Deuteronomy about the color of cloth that you have to use to do this certain things, and the way in which it has to be done, who has to place it, and they're blue and they're red cloths, and all these other things, and there's all kinds of descriptions there. So there's the census is taken, and it really kind of starts to set up what's going on. But these tribes are divided around different areas. So there's the camp of Judah, and they're divided up into groups. The camp of Judah there, the tribe of Judah is the leaders of the people. They're the people that are kings and rulers come out of the clan of Judah. The Messiah comes out of the clan of Judah later on. They're the leaders of that, and they have these others, Issachar and Zebulun. Those are also they're divided into that because they are all related. Kind of all these tribes are divided up a little bit according to who their mom was. Israel, Jacob had a couple of wives, several wives, and different kids with different wives, and so they're kind of we're closer together because we're real brothers, and these are kind of our stepbrothers, and we're kind of divided a little bit from them. And so there's some of that division. There's also some age division, whereas there's a little bit of an age gap between me and my younger brother, and we're not real close. But these other two brothers are kind of born around me, so some of those divisions start to happen and set up. But these are kind of where the tribes, these brothers, these sons of Israel, kind of became closely related. And since you only married within your own tribe, most of the time, you might marry within one of the other tribes that was close to you, but you only typically married within your own tribe. Then that kind of continued as people developed. They kind of started to do that stuff. So they started that. So the Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun are in the east, and they're set up there. You got the camp of Dan there to the north. Those three tribes. The camp of Reuben to the south, and the camp of Ephraim to the west. Now, the reason they're divided up kind of that way, and the way they're doing that, is that they would also march this way. So they would march around there. So when they are always marching east, kind of heading towards the promised land. They're marching east, and so Judah was the largest tribe, and they would lead that thing, and then the other tribes would march on the north or the south side of things to keep safe from anybody coming from the side, and then the camp of Ephraim would march behind to protect the rear guard kind of stuff. And so they would march in tribes. When they made camp, set up the tabernacle, set up all those tribal Levi tents around the tabernacle. Then these tribes would also set up their tents in kind of in these areas. And so they had to stay in their own area. And they had to march together. And that's kind of how they worked it. So the census was taken, and the census is there. To kind of talk about that, and there's a couple of things that it does when you have the census, and that is that it's first and foremost to count the number of the tribes of the people eligible to fight. So that when they're in struggle, there's a fight happening. So you can see kind of on this image that I've given you, there's also numbers kind of what you understand from the census numbers of how many people were in the tribes. So you can see the different sizes of the tribes and which ones are larger and which ones are smaller. And that becomes kind of important as the thing goes on. Now, down through the history, if we trace the history of all of this, down beyond this, the rest of the Old Testament, we start to see why some of these tribes, when the kingdom divides north and south later in the Old Testament story, why some of these tribes go together. We start to see why some of these tribes take more prominence than the other, why some of them seem to disappear from the history books as we start to read some of the later stories about the nation of Israel. So first and foremost, it was to count the number of fighting in. It was also there to demonstrate God's faithfulness, to think about this is how many people you have now, this is how many people you left Israel with, and this is how many people you have now. And it was to show God's faithfulness with those who were ready to now enter the promised land. And then the census was there for the priest. And the priest was that tribe of Levi. Their census for them was a little bit different. They were lovers, not fighters, or they were holy people, not fighters. So they didn't as much do that as much as the other tribes did. They were there to defend. They were the last line of defense to offer themselves in defense of if anybody got through the other defense to protect the tabernacle. But they were there around there to do that, and they counted them. But as they counted them, they wanted to know who was in age between 30 and 50, because you had to be 30 years old in order to be active as a priest, but you could not be older than 50 to be active as a priest. And that's kind of an Old Testament law. It's kind of rooted in all that stuff, and that kind of becomes a thing. It shows a couple of things. It shows the maturity. You can't start at 30. Now think about this. What we think we understand about Jesus' ministry is that the way rabbinical training worked is that you would be about 30 years old before you'd be released as a rabbi to be able to get your own disciples. So we think that Jesus' ministry started at the age of 30. So this kind of law, kind of holiness kind of understanding of things carries over throughout the New Testament kind of community and things like that. It was there to show some physical strength, because if you were 30, you may not have been strong enough to do some of the things they were asking you to do, and if you were over 50, you couldn't do that anymore. So there you go. So that y'all can take into that whatever you want to take into. I don't care. So there was a retirement at 50. You had to retire. You retired from regular service, but you then took on an advisory role. After 50, they were not completely removed, but they transitioned to less strenuous duties and assistants and advisors to younger Levites and priests and kind of mentor people. I moved into my house. It was a new construction. I moved into my house, and my next door neighbor moved into my house. They're newlywed couples. They're young. I'm always kind of impressed that this is not our first house. We had to work up to a house like we've got now. We didn't buy a house like that when we first were married, but they did. And so we were talking about things. And one of the things that we had to do when you move into a new construction is you had to take care of your yard, and then we needed to aerate and oversee our yard. So he and I were talking one day, and he said, "Well, we ought to just rent an narrator and then an overseer. We got to run this through thing. So I said, well, I talked about it a little bit. And then he came back and he goes, well, I think I'm going to go out and do it this weekend. I said, that's great, that's good. He goes, what are you doing? You want to do it? I said, well, I tell you what, I have paid somebody to do my yard. And he's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, when I was your age, I would have done it myself too. But I'm over 50 years old now. I am not physically able to do as much as I used to be able to do, and I'm at a point where I can afford to pay somebody to do it for me. So that was kind of where, that's how life kind of still works today in a lot of ways. So they kind of could do that. So
plus, I got to work this weekend.
Plus, I got to work.
I don't know.
There's a bowl game I want to watch. So these tribes are divided up in kind of interesting ways. Some of the other things that are there that I'll look at is the tribes will have they have banners, standards that they carry for them, and everyone has their own thing. And the four groups have one together. The Judah is the lion of Judah. We know that kind of reference, right? We've heard that before. They're to the east. The Reubens, they had an image of a man on their thing. They were to the south. Ephraim was an ox to the west, and Dan, tribe of Dan, was to the eagle. They were the north. They kind of were there. They were marched in that order also for military reasons, because that was the way they keep them safe. So that's how we do that. So anyway, so it's kind of interesting that all that stuff happens and kind of how that works. So God's presence is, as we get to the next section of Numbers, after it kind of gets lined out for us and how we're going to go, these chapters shift from a physical order to a moral or ritual purity, emphasizing that the entire community must reflect God's holiness. So there's a couple of things there. There's a talk about what you must do when something is unclean and how you remove all the unclean stuff. This includes things like people with contagious skin diseases or bodily discharges or any contacts with a corpse. They got to be expelled from the camp. And some of this would be kind of you're out for good, and some of this would be kind of you're out for a period of time until you're able to come back in and be a part of that. There was an idea that you could be defiled, not even just because of sinfulness, but you can't when you're defiled in any way. You can't immediately be in God's presence, because again, it's a holy God living amongst an unholy people. And so if there was some way in which your unholiness was showing up, some bodily discharge, then you would not be able to do that. Some skin disease would happen. There are also, yes.
Were these only applying to the men in this group?
No.
Because of the women having children, having babies, and
there are ways in which that was the case as well. They would be sent away kind of to do
get all that
within that period of time. They would be outside the camp. And the thing about being outside the camp is it's not only just you're outside the camp, but you're also outside the protection of this arrangement of these tribes that are doing that stuff. So if you have to go off and deal with whatever you're dealing with, and you come by, you have to be careful that you're not in trouble when you do that. So because you could be. There were specific laws that were set out for how you could be how your sin and restitution, how that would happen. Sin is described as breaking faith in the Lord. That will become kind of clear when we get to the end of Numbers. We talk about Moses and how that there. And required that you would do a full restitution for whatever you did. Whatever you wronged somebody, whatever you did, whatever you took from God or anything else. Plus, most of these things have there, 20%. So you had there was a 20% surcharge for the wrong party if you mess somebody up. So true repentance involved making things right with both God and the people, and words alone were insufficient. It wasn't enough to say, "Oh, I'm sorry." You had to kind of do something about it and kind of do that stuff. There was a test for adultery, a judicial process that was put in place for a suspected adulteter, highlighting the seriousness of the break in the covenant of marriage and how that's important. Now, we think about that part of the story, and you read through some of that stuff, and you think about New Testament, and you think about the woman caught in adultery, and when they bring her to Jesus, and Jesus starts drawing them in the sand and kind of ask that question, let the innocent among you cast the first stone. And I always say my favorite part of that story is they say, beginning with the oldest to the youngest, they walked away. Because the longer you live, the more you realize, I ain't perfect. I messed up. And so the older guys started, okay, I can't really, I'm not innocent, I can't cast the first stone. And so they walked away. When you're young, you think you can do anything, right, and you're perfect, and you haven't messed up, and you start to realize real quickly that's not true. But I think they started to have this kind of conversation, and I think there's a way in which this is a part of this kind of stuff happening still in that culture that day, that they're doing this kind of these tests that even the Old Testament holiness kind of rules kind of set out for them. There's a Nazirite vow and a call to personal holiness. Nazirites were those that were set aside in certain ways. They were not allowed to cut their hair. Think of people like Samson. Think of other people like that where everything else is happening. There's ways in which you take vows and not defile yourself with other things. And it's not just, I'm not just holding to this standard. I'm holding myself to a higher standard because I'm taking this Nazirite vow.
You didn't have to be a Levite to do that, right?
You did not have to be a Levite to do that. Yeah. So other people could take that, but you didn't have the same. The privileges were based on your tribe or your clan, not based on the vows you took of being a part of another part of a community. So you couldn't take a Nazirite vow and then function as a priest if you were the tribe of Zebulun or something like that. So that doesn't have to work. So holiness required intentional separation from the ordinary and a commitment to self. Now it's kind of like what we would think of like a convent or a monastery or something like that, and say you don't have to do this to be a Christian, but this is the way I'm going to take on this extra kind of do that. And I think that still becomes something that we do today, I think. So there's also a priestly blessing that was in that whole thing. It was God promises to bless his people and call them his own, and he does that by having these priests who kind of mediate between God and the people, and they're again held to a higher standard, but are holiness and how they're supposed to do. There's a consequence if you disregard the holiness that Numbers lays out for you. There's a couple different places, chapter 12, chapters 16 and 17, chapters 20 and 21. There's places like that where it kind of jumps back and forth and tells that. Throughout the journey, there are instances of rebellion that serve as stark reminders of the fatal consequences of disobeying God, treating God's holiness in lightly kind of a way. The first thing is there's Miriam and Aaron's rebellion. There's a sense in which there's this battle between there's Moses and there's Aaron and there's Miriam, and they're all the siblings, and they're kind of right there and they're doing this stuff. And there's a sense in which it's hard to sometimes for one of them not to think they're more important than the other. I was at Jonah and Sarah, my son-in-law's graduation from seminary, and the preacher of the day, the seminary professor, did this talk about how we need more Aaron's and Miriam's than we need Moses's. Now we don't need all these. I'm thinking, wait a minute. Now you got to read the whole story there. You can't just read part of the story because there's some problems with some of their stuff too. So Miriam is kind of struck with a skin disease for challenging Moses' unique authority, showing that leadership is kind of a holy calling and can't be challenged. It's whatever God decides. That was kind of the understanding of leadership for sure that day. There's a rebellion of a person called Korah. Korah and his followers are either swallowed by the earth or consumed by fire. They were trying to do the priestly roles without being consecrated. So they weren't priests, but they thought, well, anybody can do this. Well, what's the big deal? And they were told they couldn't do that. And so it became there. And then there's a story of Moses' disobedience. And we'll talk about that in more detail. But Moses, when they get water from the rock and all that kind of stuff, there's a moment where Moses doesn't trust God's statement and he disobeys that, and then he gets punished for that, and we'll talk about that again in more detail in just a second. There is a ultimate remedy for impurity when you are impure. It kind of points to how God deals with persistent sin. And there's this idea of the water purification, and this is there's this complex ritual that's laid out in Numbers about how you have the ashes of a red heifer provides a means of cleansing for when you come in contact with contamination, which a corpse kind of added and contaminated from that. This extensive kind of ritual kind of gives an idea that there's a sacrifice that's necessary for that, and that would develop later. And obviously, a lot of people have taken that and kind of give a foreshadowing of even Christ's ultimate sacrifice there. There's the story of the bronze serpent, which is one of the weirdest stories, I think, after we have this conversation about not having a golden calf and not having all these images and everything else. And the people complain, and God sends venomous snakes. And then he provides a way for the people to get out of these snakes by having Moses to have this staff with a golden bronze serpent on top of it. And he lifts it up, and when he lifts it up, the people were saved and everything like that. And a lot of people, and even in the New Testament, there's a reference to this. It kind of shows some of the things when, like Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so Christ was lifted up. This kind of the statement is made, and so it's just an interesting story because it really does kind of fit in the midst of everything else that we talk about with images and how that works. The interesting thing that happens in all of this stuff is that Moses is not permitted to lead and live into the promised land. So let me tell you this. I'm going to have to do. That. I left my my Bible downstairs, so I'm going to look it up on my phone because I can do this easier that way. Probably. I don't know why I took it downstairs to make a copy of the image and find the image, and I left it down there.
You want a paper one?
Huh? Yeah, I'll just
This one.
if we look at Numbers 22, thank you. We look at that. We start to Numbers 20. Excuse me. We start to read Numbers 20. We start to understand that there's some interesting statements about why Moses wasn't allowed to enter into the Promised Land. So I'm going to read at least part of this and how this kind of works, and then we'll talk about what happens in this story. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There, Miriam died and was buried. So Miriam died. She's not able to enter the Promised Land. Now, there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They said, well, you let us out here. And they quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? So we were better off in Egypt, is what they basically say. We should have stayed there. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down. The glory of the Lord appeared to them. So they went to the tabernacle. They went to the tent of meeting, and they started to mediate on behalf of the people of God. The Lord said to Moses, take the staff, you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink. So he says, let's go and say, look at what God's going to do. God's going to provide for you, and you're going to say something to the rock. And this is what Moses does. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and the livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he was proved holy among them. So what happens here in this story is that Moses is there, and the people are quarreling. They're complaining about that, and he's kind of doing all that stuff. So there's this incident of all that happened. There's a complaint. They complain about how things aren't happening, and they should have stayed back in Egypt. They were better off there. At least they had food to eat and water to drink. But now they're out in the desert, and they're going to die of thirst, and their animals are going to die of thirst. And what are we going to do? And you know, I mean, the thing about this story that in some way amazes me is that think about all the things these people have seen since they left. So they saw the plagues that happened in Egypt. They walked through the Red Sea on dry land. They wandered in the wilderness. They've seen all these things happen through all this kind of stuff happening, and God has provided them in so many ways. And now they're going like, but now we don't need water because God's not going to give us the water. And how do you not trust that? But then I also think about this. After several months after 9/11 happened, the church I was at, a larger church I was at in Louisville at the time, like a lot of churches after 9/11, saw a large swell of people. I mean, our pews were packed all the time, right? And it lasted a couple of months. And then all of a sudden, it was back to normal. And our worship leader kind of said, I don't understand it. Where do all these people go? How they don't they understand why do they need God when this was happening, and now they don't need God when this is happening? And I just looked at him and I said, Tom, have you read your Old Testament? Because that's the story of the Old Testament. That's continually what we do, is that we get into this point where we want clamor for God, and we trust in God, and God does these things, and we're like, oh, wow, God, you're amazing, oh my gosh. And then we kind of get comfortable, and we kind of go, well, no, we don't really need God. We can do this on our own, and we kind of ebb and flow with our stuff like that. So that's kind of how the complaint worked. God commanded Moses to speak to a rock, and it would yield water. And Moses disobeyed. Instead of speaking, he struck the rock staff twice with his staff, and him. So there's a consequence to that. God tells Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of Israel, you will not bring this assembly in the land I've given us. That's why Moses is not allowed to go into the Holy Land, is because what Moses did there, and what is the danger, I think, that all of us think, some of us more as preachers than anything else, is that we like to sometimes think, I'm able to do this because of me. So when Moses strikes the rock, then it almost becomes about Moses and not about God. And if he had just said, look what God's going to do, God's going to bring water out of that rock, then there would have been a way in which he would have trusted God to do what God said he was going to do. But Moses thought he needed to be a part of the solution, and so he struck the rock, and so he was not allowed to go into the Holy Land. And so that starts to happen. So again, there's some reasons for that punishment that happens there. And we might think about this when we think about our own holiness and why we might face some punishment or some understanding of things. There's an unbelief and a lack of trust. You know, really trust that God's going to do that just by speaking the word and all that happens. There's a failure, it says, to sanctify God. Their actions presented also God as angry and frustrated rather than holy and gracious. So he said, when Moses says, you rebels, and and strikes the rock, and kind of almost a violent kind of demonstration, it's almost as if God is, Moses is saying God is an angry God and needs to punish the people, and he's not being a gracious God. And a lot of this dealt with Moses' kind of ongoing impatience and anger with the people. So the outcome is Moses was not allowed to see the promised land from a distance, from Mount Nebo, it says, but you weren't allowed to go into it. So you can see you've been leading these people out of Egypt. You led these people through this wilderness for 40 years. You've done all this stuff. Now you're going to get to see it from a distance, but you're not going to be able to go in. And it also says that Aaron would die first, followed by Moses, he led them to the border of Canaan, and then Joshua took over for leadership. So there's this idea that these people who were leading them, they did not get to see the result and do that stuff. I think one of the things that's true of all of us that seek to serve God in whatever way we do so, is that we often don't get to see the results of your labors, and kind of sometimes it's delayed. I always say I always liked cutting grass. I'm old enough now that I just pay somebody to cut my grass, but I used to love to cut grass because when I go out and I push my mower in my grass, that it would I could look back and I could see results immediate results. You don't always see that when you do things larger than you. And so I think that's part of the frustration that Moses was feeling there. So there's succession planning that happens in this story as we deal with this. After Moses starts making this series of speeches that are handled in Deuteronomy, and he talks about all the different things. And then Moses summons Joshua and said to him in the sight of all of Israel, "Be strong and bold, for you are the one that will go with these people into the land." So there's a public transition that happens. Moses does that for a couple of reasons. One, I think Joshua has to acknowledge that he is going to accept this role before the nation of Israel. He has to publicly say, Moses, I hear you say this. You're not just pulling me aside and say, look, I'm about to die and you're going to take over. I mean, he's doing this publicly so that Joshua gets to see that there's a thing happening. And there's also needs to be a national acknowledgement. The nation of Israel must kind of accept the fact that Joshua is Moses' sole legitimate successor, because somebody else could say, well, why isn't it me? Why don't I do this? Why don't I do this? So, and after this, Moses kind of steps aside in the most complete possible way to take all questions out of the things. It says Moses dies. So Moses is dead at the end of this book of Numbers, and kind of how that happens. So the whole purpose of the book of Numbers is really to constantly demonstrate God's holiness and our inability to kind of meet those demands. It emphasizes the need for grace, for mediation, for living a life kind of set apart, survive in God's presence. Ultimately, it points to kind of a New Testament reality that for us as Christians, that Jesus is our high priest who mediates on our behalf and who fulfills all the requirements of all that stuff. So we're kind of in a different relationship with God after we're doing that. But we have to set up the whole kind of the way in which this works before we get to the point of now it's going to be different. So Numbers is a really interesting kind of historical book, because it tells a lot of the history of Israel as they travel through the beginnings toward the end of their time in the wilderness. And it really kind of trusts that there's a sense in which, again, there's a holy God, and how do we live as an unholy people in the midst of a holy God. So that's kind of the book of Numbers in a nutshell.